about the book, that French book that was written. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, about how history was written, how you came to know the history that you know? How you, does that make sense?
Well, I became a little bit interested in history when a student at the Methodist Primary School in Kingstown. The author of the book, Ebenezer Duncan, he wrote that book, A Brief History of St. Vincent, and each year he had an examination that was open to all the students from the primary schools. And he would set an examination paper and you would write this exam, and he would correct the papers, and at the end of that he'll declare who got the most marks. Well, I often say that on the day that I sat for that exam, it would appear that the other students didn't come to the exam, but somehow or the other I got the top marks then. And you know, he came to the school, that's the author, and he sort of he praised me for doing such a good job and actually gave me a prize for bringing first in the island in history. So I kept up my little interest in history, and it followed me through the primary school into the secondary school. And since then I've continued my interest in history. I think that at that time, a few persons really became interested in the history based on the fact that a local person had written a history book on St. Vincent, and that it was actually introduced into the schools as a textbook. In other words, we couldn't escape learning a little bit about the history of the island. That, in later years, disappeared somewhat.
What was that book based on? What was the where did that information come from? Maybe you can talk a little bit about the French and the English writing history from their point of view.
Well, to answer the question in the first part, that book carried a lot of the information on the Carib War. It was mainly on the Carib War and the outcome of the Carib War. But there was a second section of the book, Studies in Citizenship, which dealt more or less in civics. But the book was mainly the struggles between the Caribs and the British. Unfortunately, the source from which Mr. Duncan drew his information was, of course, very British, and it presented more the British point of view rather than just a general point of view. The Caribs were not seen, perhaps, in the very best light in that interpretation because, of course, the Caribs were seen to be the enemies. Although they were the persons who were there on the island, they were seen to be the enemies. Well, you could imagine what the situation was, so that the account would have been a little bit slanted in that direction. Of course, the main book that came out after that was an account of I think the Carib Wars by Charles Shepherd. And again, Charles Shepherd was employed by the British to write the account of the Carib War. Well, if you're employed by somebody to write an account about a war, you would write it virtually from their point of view and not necessarily from the point of view of the persons who were, on the opposite side, who happened to be the Caribs. And so a lot of the sources that we have in the early writing of the history of St. Vincent all tended to present the British point of view. Now, I've often said that when the indigenous people were here, they tried to write their own history, but the way they wrote it on stone and in caves and that sort of thing. Up until today, we are unable to decipher everything that they've written. The next time around, they asked the persons who were there with them on the island to write it for them, and the English wrote their point of view. Now the time has come for those of us who are perhaps born in the West Indies and who understand a little bit more of what perhaps exists today in relation to what was there before. We are almost redefining the terms, we're almost rewriting the history, and certainly giving a different type of interpretation to what was there and what was written before. I mentioned earlier on that we have had the opportunity to get some of the French records, and they're being now translated for us so that we can get a better idea and a more balanced idea, because the French played also a very important part in the development of these territories. Therefore, you can't take just a one-sided point of view that it was only the English who had any sort of contact with the people on the island.
Well, didn't Father Breton write a book about the Caribs? And can you tell me anything about that book? What the name of it was, or?
I think it's just simply called the Caribs, and what happened is that it would appear that there was a priest living among the Caribs, and he thought that the Caribs were not perhaps being as fairly treated as they should be, and he made a document and sent it away to France, hoping that some action would have been taken to improve the lot of the Caribs. Whatever happened to that document, we are uncertain, but the document was not, what was suggested was not put into any meaningful terms, and the document itself was stored and hidden away for a long time, and more recently became available and was sent back again from France to the West Indies, where a priest, Father Breton, I think his name is, he did a translation and made the information available. Now, that was a very good document in that it opened up the understanding of the people of who the Caribs were. For instance, the Caribs were always seen only through the eyes of the British. But with the coming of that, it widened the view. There was a much broader horizon. We could think then of the Caribs as normal human beings trying to live their own life in their particular way, in the way that which they knew how to live it. But before that, what we got was the English trying to force the Caribs down into their mold, which was not very acceptable.
Okay. This is great. This is terrific. Just keep the camera rolling. Don't turn it off. We're just going to talk a little bit about, figure out what else would be important to cover, just to try to see what else. I think you covered the history really well. One of the things that I'm curious about personally is I've heard that the Caribs were the originators of guerrilla warfare. So I'm just curious if you know any specific stories that, that supports that theory,
Not of a specific story, but as I mentioned earlier on, the method of the warfare was what gave it the name of guerrilla warfare. In other words, the army would be, the British Army would be marching along. There are no Caribs at all in sight. And as they go past, thick bush on either side of the route that they're using, suddenly an army of Caribs would emerge from the bushes. You couldn't see them there before. They were camouflaged, and this new camouflaged uniform that we're wearing, you notice that it's supposed to depict the hills and the trees and the sun and the browns and the greens mixed together. Well, this is what apparently was used. They were there, peeping out from behind the bushes without being seen. And then they would just suddenly attack. And having attacked and done whatever damage they could, they would retreat back into the bushes. And if you came there a few minutes after, whether they were there or not, you would not see them. They would just be there but not being seen. And that was after that technique proved to be so valuable. I understand that it was used by the British Army in the East, in some of the warfare they had out in the Far East in the early years. So it was transferred, that technique was transferred and is now quite common.
I think when I was up on the one side, on the windward side, we passed something called the Bloody Bridge. Do you know what the story is about the Bloody Bridge?
There have been several stories about that, but I am not 100% sure, and I wouldn't like to add my own story to it.
Okay. All right. Then the other area of interest that I'm curious about is the yellow versus the black Caribs. There were two different cultures that were here on the island. Why didn't they all mix together as, you know, let me just discuss it with you before I ask the specific question. Why didn't they all mix together? Why today, or are the descendants today both of yellow and Carib ancestries? Are they claiming one ancestry today? These are kinds of the things that I'm thinking about. I don't know how to put that into a question that you can answer, but maybe you can add some of your thoughts to it.
Yes. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, we had a situation where, as far as we know, the first lot of people would have come up through the islands as early as about 7,000 BC. Those would have been the people labeled as the Siboneyes. Then, around about the turn of into BC, AD, you had the Arawaks coming through. Now, the Arawaks preceded the Caribs, actually living for a long time on these islands. The reason for leaving South America, we have several reasons adduced now, but they were here. And then by about 1000 AD, you have the full appearance of the Caribs on the islands. Now, the story is that Christopher Columbus came to this part of the world, and we are pretty certain that according to the records, he did not actually land on St. Vincent, but he came through this area, 1490s, so that you have for nearly 500 years the Caribs holding this island as if it was their own. Now, if you've been in possession for something for that period of time, you are not going to let any persons come in and just take it over just like that. And that is what made all the difference. Now, allegedly, these would have been the yellow Caribs, or descendants of the yellow Caribs, or descendants of the mixture of the Arawaks and the yellow Caribs. Now, what we find next happening is that we believe that some of the people from Africa had already crossed the Atlantic and come to the northern coast of South America and Central America as early as about 1100 AD. We are not sure how many. We are not sure how their coming seriously influenced the people who were here. But we know it's in the records that when Columbus came to this area, he already knew that there were people who were crossing from Africa to this part of the world and who were trading with the people who lived in this part of the world in gold. And so we believe that there was some influence of people of African descent among the Caribs as early as that. But as we go further into the history, you have more people of African origin getting into contact with those people who are on the island, St. Vincent being one of them. And out of that, as I said earlier, we believe we had the Garifuna people emerging. I'm not sure that I've answered all that you wanted there, but if you want to just ask a little bit more. Anything of particular interest
Well,
there?
today, are there descendants of both yellow and black Caribs? And do they differentiate themselves on this island?
Well, let me take that question because it's an interesting question. I did say that you had the people who were exiled. You had those who remained, who were in the bush, ran away into the forest, and a few who were exiled again. That's an exile in itself to the northern part of the island. In other words, the few people of Carib extract, whether of yellow or black, would have been pushed virtually into an exile of their own. But they too, as you realize, were mixed because they were the mixtures as well as those who were black. And by then, of course, shortly after the exile to Central America, you had the influx of slaves from Africa. No, it has always been accepted that the Garifuna were never slaves. They had to come when the passage was different. Either they came with the early traders or on different occasions, but they were not the first lot of slaves who came. Now, the French were the people who were credited as having brought the first slaves onto St. Vincent, so that some of the slaves also fought with the black Caribs, and some did not. So that you had a mixture of persons on the island there. Now, a small island, 13 by 11 square miles, 133 square miles, you had to learn to live with each other somewhere along the line. You couldn't forever sort of keep out of each other's path. And it was just normal that whatever was the previous mixture, that mixture would continue and would continue as long as nobody made any deliberate attempt to stop it. Now, we've had other incidents here where we had a number of persons who came from Barbados after the sugar industry fell out, and they moved to the Dorsetshire Hill and so on. For a long time, they remained almost as an entity on its own, but now that has virtually disappeared. And that is what will happen to minority groups if they're small enough. If they're large enough, they will survive, but if they're small enough, they will disappear. And that is what happened. And the people who moved up to the new Sandy Bay, the old Sandy Bay as it was called and so on, were only 100 and something families or something like that, a very small number, so that you wouldn't expect them to go on for another 1,000 years unless they mixed with other people. If they remained as they were put there, they would disappear completely. And that there's any trace of them now is due to the fact that they mixed in with other persons who came into that area.
So the Carib community now thinks of themselves as one people. Is that what you're saying, pretty much?
Well, I am not sure what the individual views of persons in the Carib communities would be like, but I think that most persons see the Carib groups as part of people who are Vincentians. That is how I think that it is. I may be far from correct, but that is how I think I've perceived it over the past. I don't hear anyone who's asking for a job saying, well, I am a Carib, so give me a job. You know, they ask for a job as a Vincentian and not with heavy overtones that they are from the Carib community. And people from the Carib community have occupied various positions of, you know, in our communities. So I don't think that a heavy amount of discrimination exists on persons who are of Carib descent in St. Vincent as of today. I don't think so. There will be, of course, the individual accounts, but I don't think that in the main that people of Carib descent are marginalized completely.
How many more minutes do we have? 11 minutes? Okay. Is there, I think we've really covered a lot of stuff. Does anybody else have any other questions, or do you have something else that you'd like to add, or is there anything
No,
that
I
I
also
just left out, or do you have any questions that you have? Is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, yes. I'd like to add this because coming out of William Young's account of the Caribs on the island of St. Vincent, he put forward the point that the women, the Carib women, were only used as beasts of burden. If ever you saw a Carib family, the man would be in front strutting like a peacock with his little knife in his side, and his wife would be behind with the big basket of stuff on her head, towing it along and so on. Because it was the women who did the farming, and it was the women who took the farm produce to market. So whereas the husband was the hunter, he'd be there, but he's not doing anything but hunting when hunting is necessary, or going to war when it was necessary to go to war. In the case of the Carib women then, they were just beasts of burden. They would put the food for the husband on the table, and they and the children would retire to the corner of the room and sit there until the husband had fed himself, and whatever he left on the table was what they got to eat. That was the kind of picture that they gave of the Carib woman. Now, in later records, especially coming out from the French, we realize that that was not always the case. As early as that period, there were Carib women who were going to Martinique, to the convent in Martinique for education. So that you could see why we need to get that balanced account of not only the English side of the view, but the French side of the view. There's another thing of importance as regards the agriculture. The English never knew the pattern of agriculture which was adopted by the Caribs. In the thirst for acquiring land, they felt that no man should have just a lot of land and cultivate a little tiny piece of it and be allowed to keep the rest of the land. That is why they made almost a law of taking away from the Caribs lands which they didn't have under cultivation. What they didn't know that several of the Caribs had large areas cultivated within the forest area. They never knew that because they never crossed the boundaries into the forest areas. So that whereas they were thinking of the Carib agriculture as being extremely primitive,
Does it blow again?
I think it's only going to be once this time.
All right.
Yes,
Can
okay,
you start
yes.
Sorry, start the thought again. Sorry. Just go ahead. Whereas, you were saying, yes,
Sort of.
they
Where
didn't
were we?
know that they had lands inside the
Oh,
forest.
yes.
They thought
Okay, they didn't
had-
know, yes. They didn't know that they had land under cultivation within the forest area, and that they thought that the only lands that they saw under cultivation was the only area under cultivation. And so they thought that the Caribs had no right owning all that amount of land and not cultivating it. One other thing, we have thought about the Caribs on St. Vincent as existing as one entity. It's a mistake to think of the Caribs of St. Vincent as if they acted in isolation from all other groups in the other islands and so on. That was not the case. There was a lot of communication between the Caribs of St. Vincent and Caribs elsewhere, and between the French and the Caribs. In other words, there was a lot of traffic going on between St. Vincent and St. Lucia and Grenada and Martinique and Guadeloupe, and they did so with some canoes which were very, very quick through the water, and some of them could carry as many as nearly 80 men, we are told, when they were ferrying soldiers and so on. And we remember that it was on the Maroon, on Grand Sable Beach, that when the Caribs had surrendered, that the English came down and burnt something like 200 canoes on the beach. And that is what brought the war effort to an end, because that was the communication link. They had no television, they had no radio and so on, but the Caribs were very swift in their canoes, ferrying people backward and forward, ammunition backward and forward, food backward and forward and so on. And they moved from the Orinoco right up to Cuba. And so later on, when that French Revolution was taking its hold through the islands, that was perhaps one of the methods that was used to transfer information and so on up and down through the islands. And we should never think that St. Vincent was cut off from the rest of the world. It certainly was not cut off from the rest of the West Indian islands, and perhaps cut off from the world, but not from the other islands around.